Hi, I'm Geoffrey. Welcome back to Nightfalls. Come, settle in for tonight's calming meditation and soothing bedtime story. As always, don't worry if you fall asleep before the end. You can drift off whenever you're ready. Come, settle in by the fireside tonight, and let me tell you of another of Lawrence Hargreaves' two-wheeled adventures. I've always found Lawrence's tales of long winding cycles through the countryside rather perfect to wind down and drift off to. And tonight's tale is no different. Following the ambling river wharf as it twists and turns, carving a path out to the ocean, Lawrence is able to enjoy all of the rich natural beauty and fascinating history that the quaint English countryside has to offer. Allow yourself to be transported tonight, and so too can you. Before we begin, here's a quick word from our valued sponsors who make this free content possible.
This episode is brought to you by Certified Piedmontese Beef. Listen up, foodies. Make your next meal even better with real Nebraska beef. They have healthy, tender, delicious Italian heritage beef, grass-fed and sustainably raised on lush pastures in the Midwest. You can even create your own personally curated meat box that's shipped right to your door. To get 2 free steaks with any purchase over $50, use the code FREEBEEF at checkout. Learn more and shop exclusively at cpbeef.com.
Major phone carriers make you sign contracts with rigid data plans to trap you into a kind of forced phonogamy. Sounds pretty insecure if you ask me. At Consumer Cellular, we believe in a more consensual and healthy form of phonogamy, free of contracts and more flexible to your data needs. This way, you stick around not because we force you to with contracts and fees, but because you love our phone plans. Like ardently love our phone plans. Phonogamously. Consumer Cellular. When freedom calls, we're here to answer. Call us at 1-888-FREEDOM.
For the best way to fall asleep with Nightfalls, you can now become a premium supporter. Enjoy the entire back catalogue of Nightfalls classics, all with a rich, immersive, and totally ad-free experience. If you love falling asleep to Nightfalls, Nightfalls Premium will elevate your sleep while helping to support myself and the team. We love creating Nightfalls, but without supporters, it wouldn't be possible. Join Nightfalls Premium today in just 2 taps on both Apple Podcasts or via the Supercast link found in the show notes for all other podcast players. Your sleep will thank you for it, and so will I.
In sharing poems, we take a moment to pause and acknowledge the world's magnitude and how poets illuminate that mystery. The Slowdown podcast is your guide on the pathways to feel and understand our common journey through poetry. I'm Major Jackson, the newest host of the Slowdown podcast, and I invite you to join me for a hand-picked poem and a moment of reflection every weekday. You can listen to the Slowdown now, wherever you get your podcasts.
Just before we begin tonight's tale, why not take a moment to relax and wind down with me? Come to settle in a comfortable position and let your eyes drift closed, marking the end of another long day. like a full stop might mark the end of a sentence. This is your time. So, drawing a deep breath in through your nose and sighing out through your mouth. Let go of the chaos of the day. Draw the perfect stillness of this moment alone into your body on your in-breath. And as you exhale, release any stress or strain bound up within you. Feel that negative energy draining from your body on the rolling tide of your out-breath. Now, center your attention on the sound of my voice as you let your brow soften. Release your jaw. Let your tongue fall away from the roof of your mouth and allow the soothing evening air to drift unobstructed in through your nose and out through your mouth. Breathe with me in and out. In and out. Inhale and exhale. Allow your breath to wash the day away as we sink together in a state of deep relaxation. Give the full weight of your head to the soft cushions beneath you. Let your shoulders relax. Soften the muscles across your ribs and release your abdomen. Tonight, let it all go. You are safe. There is nothing for you to do. There is nowhere for you to be. So grant yourself permission to be soft, to be relaxed, as day gives way to night, and you give yourself over to the growing weight of exhaustion as Lawrence's tale begins. Lawrence Hargreaves rested his hands on the handlebars of his bicycle and took a moment to savor the freshness of an early morning in May. An adventure awaited him. Behind him, the train which had brought him to the spa town of Ilkley pulled away and continued on its journey. Lawrence wheeled his bicycle along the platform and towards the exit. He shared a smile with a fellow cyclist whom he'd spoken to on the train. There was a silent agreement in their eyes of today being perfect for cycling through the stunning landscape of the Yorkshire Dales. The route Lawrence was planning to take had been cycled by him many times over the years. No matter the varying nature of the English weather, and today's clement weather promised a most pleasant ride. He had to admit that May was his favourite month. It was a time when spring was holding her hand out to summer, and the frosty days of winter were a distant memory. He left the station and took in the sights of Ilkley as he walked along. Its Victorian architecture, parades of shops, the alluring assortment of tea rooms, and the well-kept flower beds, bedecked with vibrant blossoms and plants, which were a delight to behold. Ilkley was situated on the very edge of the Dales. Its rich history went as far back as the Bronze Age, and the town had even been recorded in the Domesday Book of 1086. Thanks to its therapeutic waters, it had become established as one of England's leading spa towns, and had attracted famous visitors such as Charles Darwin and Marie Tussaud. Lawrence's favourite part of the town's history concerned the legend of the two large rocks on the edge of the moors, known as the Cow and Calf. The legend claimed they were separated by a giant called Rumbald when he walked over them one night as he travelled across the moor. The Cow and Calf were a popular tourist attraction, and so was the public house, which shared the same name. Lawrence fastened his helmet, climbed onto his bike, and set off along the road. Past the cafes and restaurants he went, slowing down now and again for early morning pedestrians who were crossing the roads. As tempted as he was to stop at one of the quaint cafes, Lawrence continued on his way because he had somewhere else in mind for breakfast. Onward, he travelled on Skipton Road, his feet steady and sure on the pedals. The shops were soon left behind to be replaced by houses, some still with their curtains closed. Hanging baskets at the side of doors and windows overflowed with a brightly coloured selection of flowers. The last of spring tulips stood alongside the buds of summer roses. As Lawrence cycled further along the road, the houses became sparser, and the landscape opened up to reveal the beauty of the hills ahead. He carefully overtook a red Royal Mail van, which was parked at the side of the road. The postwoman was on the grass verge, opening the letterbox and collecting the envelopes from inside. Lawrence rode past the last of the houses and was left with the beautiful vista of the road and the countryside. He turned off the main road and onto Ilkley Road. Being a quieter stretch, it was one of his favourite sections on the route he was taking that day. Low stone walls at the side of the road were covered in dark green moss and foliage, giving the impression the walls were part of nature. Trees lined the verges, their branches outstretched, forming a leafy canopy The sun shone through gaps in the branches, causing dappled shadows to dance over the surface of the road. A feeling of peace and contentment settled on Lawrence as he cycled along at a relaxed pace. The sound of traffic from the main road faded until it became a distant hum. All Lawrence could hear now was the tweeting of birds from the treetops and the soothing, rhythmic sound of his tires on the road. It wasn't long before he made out the sound of something else. He slowed and looked to his right to catch a glimpse of the river Wharf, which ran between the counties of West Yorkshire and North Yorkshire. Like meeting up with a beloved friend, the sight of the flowing river filled his heart with joy. The river would be his constant companion throughout his journey that day, sometimes right next to him, and at other times they'd be separated by fields. But they'd never be far away from each other. He put his attention on the road ahead of him and thought about the village of Addingham, which he was heading towards, and the breakfast which awaited him there. He knew he was almost upon his destination when he saw Addingham Cricket Club on his left-hand side. With its manicured fields and single-storey clubhouse, he imagined the players striding from the clubhouse, optimistic smiles on their faces as they headed towards the pitch. And in the clubhouse, preparations would be underway for the half-time refreshments of homemade Victoria sponge cakes and cucumber sandwiches. The image of food made his stomach growl, and he increased his pace a little. Minutes later, he arrived at Hamilton's, a riverside cafe which served excellent breakfasts and offered stunning views of the river Wharf. Lawrence took a seat on the wooden veranda at the front of the cafe and gave his order of a traditional full English breakfast to a friendly-faced waiter. He leaned back and enjoyed the pleasing panorama in front of him. The river wound ever onwards on its sedate journey. Couples strolled hand in hand along the side of the water. Across the river, a few anglers had set their equipment up for a day of restful fishing. His breakfast arrived, and Lawrence tucked into it eagerly. Succulent sausages, fried egg, crispy bacon, tomatoes, mushrooms, and baked beans, with slices of perfectly toasted bread on the side, all washed down with a reviving cup of Yorkshire tea, with just one sugar to sweeten it. Once he'd finished his meal, Lawrence warmly thanked the staff for the delicious food before getting back onto his bike and cycling away. The country road gently curved this way and that way as he cycled on. The traffic was light, with just the occasional car or farm vehicle going by. Now and again, a cyclist would travel towards him from the opposite direction, and they would exchange companionable waves. The sun rose higher, and the day became warmer. Giggling children bounced happily on trampolines in front gardens. People walked their dogs along the pavement. Hanging baskets were watered. The constant noise of the bike's tires varied as the road surface changed. A signpost pointed to the nearby towns and cities of Leeds, Skipton, Keighley, and Silsden. People waited at bus stops, keeping an eye out for the appearance of a bus down the road. He cycled past the Devonshire Arms, a hotel and spa which had been built in the 17th century. He went under a low stone bridge, and soon after, he passed the Cavendish Memorial Fountain. Open fields and farmland appeared on either side of him. Seated cows grazed happily on grass. Sheep wandered over fields, some of them in pairs, as though in private conversations. Lambs gambolled between the feet of the sheep, bleating joyfully. A farmer wearing a flat cap drove an open tractor slowly between the sheep. A black and white dog was sitting upright in the passenger seat, looking left and right at the animals, reminding Lawrence of a teacher looking out over her pupils during their break time. Larger hills loomed ahead of him, the tops carpeted in purple heather. A few low-lying clouds circled the tops of the highest hills. Shadows of clouds swept across the fields, turning the swathes of greens, yellows, and browns, a few shades darker. Dry stone walls marked out the boundaries between farms, some of the walls having been constructed hundreds of years ago. Their presence brought a memory to Lawrence about a conversation he'd had with a cyclist the previous year. Miriam was her name. She had spoken of her love for the Yorkshire dales, and especially the dry stone walls which stitched the uniquely Yorkshire landscape together. She told him how she was a member of the Yorkshire Dry Stone Walling Guild and ran many courses for volunteers who were just as eager as she was to look after and preserve the unique structures. Lawrence continued on his journey and soon arrived at the small town of Burnsall, famed for its picture postcard beauty, which drew in not only tourists, but walkers, anglers, and cyclists too. The river wharf flowed gently through the village. He noticed people sitting on benches on the grass verges, gazing at the water, looks of tranquility on their faces. Doors to shops and cafes were invitingly ajar, tempting customers to enter and stay for a while. A dozen or so tourists alighted from a coach at the other side of the village green, smiles on their faces and eagerness in their steps. Lawrence looked towards a red telephone box at the side of the road and wondered if it was still used as a telephone, or if, like many others of its kind, it had been converted into one of those wonderful free libraries where a person was able to borrow a book and replace it with one of their own. Lawrence cycled slowly through the village, taking time to appreciate the old world charm of it. The road to his right led to a stone bridge which spanned the river wharf, but he turned left instead and headed towards Grassington, which was only 3.5 miles away. The road was smooth and the sun was warm on his back. The continuous turning of the bike's wheels was as soothing as the sights and sounds which enveloped him. There was nothing quite like the freedom of cycling along a country road, particularly on such a perfect day as this one. He soon reached his destination of Grassington. It was one of the largest towns on his route that day, and an area which brought in many visitors. As Lawrence cycled through the town, he noticed the cobbled streets were busy with ambling pedestrians who were taking in the wide variety of enchanting shops which the town had to offer. Grassington had changed little over the years, and in the 3 Saturdays leading up to Christmas, it hosted a Dickensian festival which transformed the town centre into a wonderland of days gone by. During that time, it wasn't unusual to see many visitors milling the streets, attired in Victorian costumes. Lawrence stopped frequently on his passage through the town to allow for pedestrians and traffic. At one stop, the delicious aroma of fish and chips came to him from a nearby cafe. It took some willpower to resist calling in to buy a portion of fish and chips, along with a side order of mushy peas. But he had plans for his next meal, and he was prepared to wait for it. He left Grassington behind and cycled the short distance towards the small village which was next on his journey, the delightfully named Appletreewick. It was a village full of fascinating history. Appletreewick had one main street which was lined with picturesque houses, some of which dated back to the 12th century. Early records told of the town being inhabited by blacksmiths, cobblers, weavers, and corn millers. The village had flourished in the 14th century and had been known locally for its famous onion fair. One of the lanes in the village was named Onion Lane in recognition of that time. It was another part of Appletreewick's history which interested Lawrence. Its most famous son was William Craven, who'd been born into a poor family in 1548. At around the age of 13 or 14, he had travelled the hundreds of miles south to London to work with a merchant tailor. A determined and industrious young man, he worked hard in a variety of jobs, which led to him eventually becoming the Mayor of London in 1610. Upon his return home years later, he put his wealth and influence to good use and constructed roads and buildings in the area. He was knighted, and his descendants became Earls of Craven. Many public houses and hotels around the Dales proudly bore the Craven name, including the Craven Arms pub, right there in Appletreewick. Lawrence had been inside the pub on a few occasions, and he'd admired the painting of William Craven, which hung there. As Lawrence rode through the village, his thoughts stayed with the inspiring man and what he'd achieved. Lawrence continued on his way, his route being almost complete. His journey would take him back to his starting point of Ilkley, but a sudden burst of energy persuaded Lawrence to take an extra detour on the way home. He soon arrived at Bolton Abbey and left his bicycle resting against a roughly cut dry stone wall. He stretched his arms high over his head and decided to stretch his legs on a stroll through the grounds. He soaked in the afternoon sun as he strode, taking in his surroundings as the ruined abbey rose up ahead of him. Not far from the wide banks of the gently flowing river wharf stood the ruins of the Augustinian priory. Built in the 12th century, the priory was constructed and inhabited by Augustine monks. During the dissolution of the monasteries in 1539, the priory was destroyed, but the careful hands of historians have kept guard over its remains in the years since. Lawrence tried to imagine the priory as it stood all those years ago. It wasn't difficult. Even in its current state, the priory was breathtakingly grand. Despite its crumbling towers and the giant holes in its facade, the structure stood proud amongst the rolling countryside, covered in reminders of its previous majesty. Huge stone arches that once held stained glass masterpieces now framed dynamic landscapes of the land around them, showing new angles and perspectives of the countryside, which were unique depending on the position of their beholder. Classical decorative carvings were still visible on the walls, though less clearly, as the engravings were now much shallower than they once were. Even weathered by the bracing Yorkshire winds and years of rain and summer sun, the abbey still held a grand, intriguing air, and Lawrence felt very glad to have made his detour Lawrence took in the Abbey from every angle, before turning back to stroll along the river, smiling as he saw children hopping on stepping stones between the banks and veering away from their splashing. Before long, he returned to his bicycle and took back to the road for the final leg of his journey. As he travelled onwards, so did the river wharf, and like a dancing partner, the river sometimes swept towards him for a while, before looping away, only to return a short while later. Lawrence got lost in the motion of his feet on the pedals, his steady breaths, and the comforting heat of the sun on his back. His mind was free of thoughts, and a peaceful feeling flowed pleasantly through him. He considered himself a fortunate man to be riding through the Yorkshire dales on such an agreeable day. Presently, he reached the streets of Ilkley, which were considerably busier than when he'd left that morning. He made his way to Betty's Cafe Tea Rooms, famous for its charmingly old-fashioned atmosphere, delicious cakes, and a fine selection of teas. Lawrence secured his bike and entered the establishment. He was immediately shown to a table by a waitress. He gave his order for a traditional afternoon tea, a meal of delicate sandwiches and cakes, accompanied with scones, which came with clotted cream and strawberry preserve, and, of course, a pot of Yorkshire tea was the perfect beverage. He couldn't think of a better way to end his journey. As he waited for his food, he settled back in his chair and thought about the wonderful sights he'd seen on his travels that day. Invitingly open roads which led him ever onwards. The awe-inspiring beauty of the villages and towns along the way. Fields upon fields stretching into the distance. Heather-topped hills with a halo of low-lying cloud swirling around them. Telegraph poles connected by looping wires. Tractors bumping along fields. Grazing cows and wandering sheep. Small streams trickling beneath bridges. Gardens resplendent with hanging baskets and flower pots. Grass verges abundant with wild flowers and hedges full of blackberries. People relaxing on benches, basking in the beauty of the landscape. And as always, the magnificent river wharf meandering its way through the enchanting dales and to the ocean beyond.